know, it's a lot of work, and I think it's a key part of how we're all going to not only survive this time of uncertainty, but get through it as, like, somebody keeps, a friend of mine says, level up, like basically making ourselves better and making our community better. And I think that's a really important part of what you're doing here and what we need to focus on. So the majority of my talk is going to be from a photojournalist perspective. I think, though, that anyone, no matter what kind of creative work you're doing, you can use a lot of these principles in that work as well. I'm going to share my screen. Let me see if I do it right. Oh no, I have to do this first. Oh, it's fun watching people use tech. Here's the screen. Okay. Is that working okay? Sure. Wonderful. Is. All right. So as David said, I won't be able to see the chats, but I always like it for these things to be a little bit more of a conversation. So if anything comes up and you guys want to shout a question out, please enter that in the chat and he will relay it to me.
I'm on it. I can see you guys' chat. So if you enter in a question, I can see it.
So first of all, I try to be really open in the community. If you guys have any questions, you just want to reach out, this is my contact information. Please feel free to keep that, write it down. I think this is also being recorded, so you may be able to reference it at a later date. So a little bit of background on me. I'm a DC-based photojournalist. I just moved here from Chicago, which I miss deeply, especially right now as we're going through this pandemic. In my work, I do a lot for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, but I'm most interested in my personal work in documenting how the environment and public. Uh-oh, am I muted?
You're good, you're good, go for it.
Okay. Told me I was muted. Ways that photography can sort of reach out to communities and ways that we can build those communities and also build relationships with other people, but whether they're the folks that we're photographing or our editors or our fellow photographers in the community. So David asked me to talk a bit about building relationships, something that we photographers do on every assignment that we go out on. And some of you are natural extroverts who wouldn't hesitate to approach a stranger. I, however, started out in photography as an extremely shy high school senior, mostly taking pictures of inanimate objects and our family dog. But I think if you take anything away from this conversation, it's to be yourself rather than mimic another photographer. Figure out how you best interact with people and what makes you interested in the world and what gives you a unique perspective. I think people respond to authenticity. And so if you are trying to be somebody you're not, they're going to pick up on that. People are smart. We have to expect a lot of them and they have to expect a lot of us. Eventually, I overcame my timidity and learned to see the camera as a passport into the lives of others, a wonderful excuse to commune with people. And that's really become a gift that I treasure deeply. And it's been hard too during this coronavirus because that suddenly changed. A lot of my work now is removed. I'm wearing a mask and I'm keeping at least 6 feet distance from people. And I'm also really minimizing the time that I'm interacting. And so I'm trying to still find that opportunity and find that relationship even in these little brief moments together with strangers. Let me see, I think, yep. So one thing I want you all to take away from this is that photographing someone can be an act of validation. Many of us would shy away from a stranger hanging out with us for hours and taking pictures of our lives, but that's part of the magic of what we do. Everyone longs to feel like their lives and experiences matter, and photographing someone can be a way of saying, you matter to me. So I'm going to start in my home state of Nebraska and share some of the lessons I've learned on assignment and in project work. This is an 86-year-old woman named Elsie Eiler. She's the sole resident of Monowai, Nebraska. You heard that right, population 1. that here she is walking down Main Street on her way to work. Elsie is Manawai. She's the mayor and tax collector, as well as the settler of disputes at the town's tavern, where she's served as the bartender and the cook and everything in between since her husband's death about 15 years ago. Going out to photograph Elsie, I expected to find someone whose life was as sparse as the surrounding countryside, a massive prairie we fly over on our ways to cities and coasts. I mean, you can send a letter that just says Elsie Manawai and it actually makes it to her. That's status, if nothing else. So friends travel from like a 30-mile radius to share a cup of coffee or a beer, to play a game of pinochle with her, or to have a burger. And I had to ask myself, what is it about Elsie that's so compelling that someone would drive that far for a conversation or for a card game? And I've realized that it's because Elsie takes the time to engage with her visitors, to sit down with them face to face and have a conversation about how their kids are doing or what's going on with their crop. How many grandchildren do they have? She has these relationships and she remembers and she's present for them. And in a hyper-connected digital world, this woman who has neither a cell phone nor a computer, let alone an email address, is among the most connected people I've ever met. Elsie taught me to take a moment to relate with the person in front of me and to really see them and to put away distractions like cell phones and Instagram. She also taught me to approach people out of curiosity, not desperation to find a story. People are very intuitive and will sense when someone is being self-serving. Consider also what your body language communicates. I avoid crossing my arms when I'm working, and I stand open and maintain eye contact. I shake hands and explain what I'm doing and why, and I never lie to gain access for a story or for a photograph. Again, it's about mutual respect for each other. You have to really, to be honest, and in a lot of ways, you have to be vulnerable with the people that you photograph. Or asking someone to be vulnerable with us. So I think it should go both ways. And if you want someone to welcome you into their home and lives, you must be available to them. So I start with a genuine and immediate smile that's often not very common with a relationship that you've just started with someone, with a stranger. But I think that there's, when you create this openness, people naturally want to give that back. In fact, it's been interesting with this, this change in how I'm working during the coronavirus, because I, in a lot of ways, have to stay back. I have to kind of change my physical body language so that people don't approach me. But people still are drawn to others. It's a very human thing, and it's honestly what a lot of our photography relies on. Elsie also taught me about how an individual story can fit into the bigger picture. Hers is about population loss and a cultural shift away from small town life. The world Elsie was born into doesn't exist anymore. And the longer we're on this earth, the more we experience that kind of change. So when I found out I was moving to Chicago to freelance from, I had previously been working as a staff photographer at the newspaper in Omaha. When I was moving to freelance, I wanted to explore this idea of loss in my work, especially among communities. And so my first couple of years in Chicago were painfully slow. And I began to drive over the Indiana border to East Chicago to visit Marktown, a century-old community built for steel company workers and their families. And so if you look at this frame, it's probably very small on some of your cell phones, but smack dab in the middle of it is a green space, and that's the community of Marktown. It's like basically 4 blocks of housing. And it used to be as many as like 300 families, and now it's down to probably about 100 at this time. This was in 2016, I think, and not 4 years later, I think it's gone down even farther. Nearly 80% of the city is zoned for heavy industries, which pollute the soil, air, and water that more than 30,000 people across the entire city depend on. And so you can see too in this image, at the top right corner, there's the largest inland oil refinery, which refines tar sand oils. It's particularly dirty process. And then on the top left and on the bottom left are steel mills. Again, this is the industry that has supported this community for so long. I heard about Marktown because that inland oil refinery was demolishing homes for purchase far below market value. Kim Rodriguez, woman pictured here, she became my point of contact in the neighborhood. And she said that her family felt more vulnerable with every house that was torn down. The empty lots were like missing teeth, she told me. Kim has lived all 65 years of her life in this community. Her father worked for Inland Steel, and her sons followed in the same footsteps. Now she raises her grandchildren in the shadows of the refinery stacks. Kim and I talked a lot. The majority of my time when I first started working on this project was about building a relationship with her and with other people in the community. It took a long while to be welcomed there too, and for understandable reasons. Because it's an unusual space, many photographers had breezed through for decades, making pictures of honestly the blight and then just disappearing. Those images propagated a narrative that didn't really show what life was like there. And so, yes, there was pollution, but there was also an awful lot of beautiful moments. So I tried to learn how the residents saw themselves and then photograph from a place of understanding. I became the self-appointed photographer for the neighborhood and would come around with prints from my last visit. And I created an Instagram account where we posted images of life in the neighborhood, just positive stuff. In fact, I opened it up to people who lived there too, so that they could post images. And it was like, again, it's like a celebration of life there. Eventually, Kim walked me around to neighbors and introduced me to the people I'd not yet met. And she said, hey, watch out for this girl. She's okay. She's part of the community. And that really opened up the story in a lot of ways. With help from outside funding, we pasted large-scale portraits of community members to fences and buildings. Several residents told me that this was the first time they ever felt celebrated. And before long, residents started to invite me to quinceañeras and weddings, which opened up new possibilities to make unexpected images and to look for opportunities to speak visually to the idea that life endures in the midst of industry and the environmental injustices that plague a lot of the Rust Belt. The story illustrated ways in which environmental public policy often does not protect low-income communities. And that idea from Monowai, the one-woman town, of change and loss existed here too. Industries that once bolstered citizens' economic futures now threaten their lives and their existences. So almost 2 years of starting to work in East Chicago, a health crisis broke out in a nearby neighborhood where nearly 1,200 residents learned that their children's blood levels were well above the poisonous threshold by the CDC. The public housing complex where they lived was knowingly built on an old lead smelter site. I had contacts on the ground, so when the culpability of the city and the industries came to light, I already knew people and was able to help bring attention to the community, including Lamont Anderson, who's pictured here, who spoke to the New York Times health reporter Abby Goodnow about learning that his family's experience upon learning that his son, Lamont Jr., had elevated levels of lead in his blood. We often meet people during some of their worst days. And as photographers, we have outsized power to affect how others are portrayed. As journalists, we're beholden to the truth, and so we need to carefully consider the consequences of our actions and images. I tend to think about, when I'm photographing someone in a sensitive situation, I tend to think about what I would want a photographer to do if they were photographing my family. What follows are 3 sensitive scenarios where I tried to be extra mindful of my approach. So I was working on a project, a series on rites of passage for Chicago Magazine. And we don't typically have the luxury to work on a project for years like I did in East Chicago.
I have to interrupt you. I have to interrupt you real quick. I just have to say, Uh, this is one of my favorite works that Alyssa has put together. So when you told me about it, I was like, oh, that sounds cool. But then when I saw it when you were done, I can count on one hand the amount of times I've been genuinely jealous of like just the opportunity that you had to like record just some important cultural moments in our city. So
Hmm.
that's all I'll
Yeah,
say.
I
Um,
felt so lucky. Go ahead, go ahead.
yeah, no, that's all I'll say. Go ahead.
I felt so lucky. This was like somewhat early on, since it was maybe a year after I had moved to Chicago that I got this opportunity. And it was such a wonderful way to get to know the city. And I really hope I can find something similar to that here in DC, because it really, it taught me how connected the city is. You know, it's a sprawling place and people kind of live in their neighborhoods and in their communities, and you don't tend to mix too much in Chicago, unfortunately. But what I realized through this story is how interconnected we all are, and like how our different rights and our different traditions, they may vary, but they also share, they are a reminder of our shared humanity. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And again, one of the beauties of photography, what it can do. So, okay, yeah, we don't usually have this much time to work on a story as I did in East Chicago. And like, so a lot of the time when I go into a situation within minutes of meeting someone, I have to get straight to work and start making pictures. And so while producing this series on rites of passage, I met Tim Riley moments before his mother, Joanna Riley, received her last rites. And before entering the room, Tim and I spoke briefly about his grief, but also his sense of relief that his mother was receiving the apostolic pardon. And taking that time to connect allowed me to be a part of the scene without affecting it, which I think is really important with photojournalism, especially. I slid into the corner and waited for Tim to reach out and grasp his mother's hand. I think that one of the hard things again about covering the coronavirus is like how you don't see people touch now. And I think when you do see people touch, it's a little bit startling. It's such a reminder of the power of physical connection between people. Last year, I made several trips to Scioto County, Ohio, one of the communities hit hardest by the opioid crisis, for a series of New York Times stories on the children of addicted parents. Layla Kaig, pictured here, is a 17-year-old high school junior who moved in with her grandmother and great-grandfather after her mother, who's a hospice nurse, began to use her patients' painkillers and then later moved on to black tar heroin, which is a pretty common transition, unfortunately. And given the sensitivity of the story, I started out by saying to Layla, hey, if there's ever a moment where this is too much for you, or you're feeling overwhelmed or unsafe, I just want you to tell me to give you some space, and I will. And I think that while we couldn't alter reality anyway, it was important to have that conversation because I wanted her to feel some sense of control, especially given the tumultuous 4 years she had just experienced as her mother fell deeper into drug use. Again, it's like, have respect for people and they'll have respect for you, and these images can come along, all about relationships. So I don't typically make images of people without asking for permission first, but this isn't always possible. While documenting the gathering at Standing Rock, I wandered away from the pack I wandered away from the pack of photographers to work along the edge and see what was happening. And I always feel like that's good advice. Anytime you're in a crowd of photographers, walk in the opposite direction, because the images that they're making are important, but they're going to be redundant in a lot of ways. So find something that stands out and that surprises you. I always want to be surprised by photographs. And so at the edge of the crowd, I found Maid LeBeau and Bobby Robideau embracing. I didn't want to interrupt the moment because that also seems wrong. So I made eye contact with Robideau, and while having my camera lifted to get sort of a tacit permission to document the two. And we spoke afterwards, and Robodote told me that their tribes were once enemies with histories of violence between them. He told me Standing Rock had become a space for healing for them. So, photography, as I have said multiple times already, is all about building relationships, whether it's with the person you're photographing or with colleagues or with editors. And so I really want to encourage you right now to create the community that you want to be a part of. You know, we're all kind of stuck at home. We're all very tied to our email and to our phones. And so if you see someone whose work you admire, I think you should reach out. And I think that you should try to put in as much as you expect out of a relationship with another photographer. And I think too that this is an opportunity to kind of, even outside of photography, build relationships with creatives where you can offer some emotional support. This is a really hard time for everyone. I don't think anyone's like delighted or over the moon right now, because there's collective grief that we're all feeling, and that's really weighing on us. So I think it's important to be that empathetic point of contact for someone at this point, and look for opportunities to support each other. I work as a mentor with the International Women's Media Fund, and my mentee last year, Hannah Yoon, has just started this really fantastic project on people documenting their lives at home. And so you're getting this really beautiful collection of photographs of people's lives during this time. And I think in a lot of ways, it's certainly scratching the photographic itch, but it's creating this sense of community that's really beautiful. This is also a really good time to build relationships with editors and clients. Again, we're all in the same boat. This is, in a lot of ways, for creatives, especially, an equalizer, where we're all sitting at home and we're all wondering when we're next going to be able to return to work. And so, you know, if there's an editor or a publication or an organization that you've always wanted to work with, I think this is a good time to invest in those relationships. I just in December sent a bunch of handwritten postcards and notes to editors and clients and fellow photographers and friends, basically expressing my love for them and my appreciation for them. And, you know, again, like tending to those relationships. And right now there are a lot of editors who are looking for work to publish. So if you have something that you had worked on as a personal project a few years ago, this might be a good time to reach out and say like, hey, this is what I'm interested in, this is what I've done. And whether or not it pays off in the immediate, it most likely will pay off in the long term. And so I'll talk about that too going forward. So the changes in our lives over the last couple of months have been pretty scary, admittedly. But I'd encourage you to take that long view. Due to the nature of COVID-19, it would be reckless for us to work as we normally do. So take this time stuck at home to reflect on what issues and themes matter to you and why. We're not sure when it'll come, but there will be life after the pandemic. And my hope is that photographers are better prepared to document it thoughtfully and empathetically because of the time in seclusion. We got loads of time to contemplate. Take advantage of it. I think it's really easy to just like dive deep into Netflix. And while we do need those escapes, also try to make it a productive time. Our lives in industry are in total flux, which can be hard to stomach, but stay on the path, do the work when it's safe. And keep in mind something that I always tell my students, which is that, you know, you may have photographers who you idolize and whose work you really admire and whose path you admire, but no two careers are going to be the same. So embrace that. It's actually a wonderful thing because you don't know where you're going to go. When I started that project in East Chicago, I believed it was going to be my last documentary project because freelance was going horribly. You know, and I was just like, well, I'm going to throw myself into this. This story is compelling to me. It speaks to a lot of things that I care about. So, you know, I spent hours upon hours there. And it ended up teaching me a very important lesson that in a competitive field like ours, you must create the work you want editors to hire you to do. So, shortly after the publication of the work in East Chicago, I received my first major travel assignment for the New York Times. It was a story about how low-income communities and people of color often shoulder the heaviest burdens of climate change. And the assigning editor made a point of telling me that he was hiring me specifically, sending me to Texas, specifically because of the East Chicago work. This is Manchester, a community outside of Houston, which was similarly surrounded by industry. Houston has a pretty massive lack of zoning laws. And so corporations like Westway Food Products, pictured at back, are able to build industrial structures mere feet from home. And Eva Morales, a daughter of immigrants, told me that owning her home was how she hoped to build wealth and stability, but that the surrounding industry was choking the neighborhood. And in Galveston, Guatemalan immigrant Adolfo Guerra works in 90 and 100-degree heat 6 days a week while studying mechanical maintenance and engineering at night. I also spent time with the Josephs, including Gregory and Larissa, pictured here, who lost their Galveston home during Hurricane Ike a few years earlier. As the summer heat bore down on us, their mother said she feared what the upcoming hurricane season would bring. And just a few weeks later, I returned to Texas as Hurricane Harvey made landfall near Corpus Christi, which then sat stationary over Houston. It felt like one of the few times that people really stopped and paid attention to climate change, because it had basically come knocking at the front door of people who had money and who had resources, and realizing like, we kind of got to do something about this. We have to wake up to it. And I think one of the encouraging things about this pandemic is that people, we are having a smaller footprint right now, and we're sort of learning to live more quietly and more in our place. And I think we need to do that, and there needs to be a cultural shift where we change our behavior for the greater good. So as you find your path in your work, look for narrative threads that interest you, then start to tug at them. Through project work and assignments that I treat like projects, I try to focus on communities threatened by their environments and by shifting cultural trends and by public policy. These experiences open my eyes to other environmental injustices in many of America's forgotten spaces. Just months after the devastation of Harvey in Texas, indigenous people and activists from all over North America and the world were gathering at the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. They left their jobs and abandoned the comforts of home to bring the nation's attention to the Dakota Access Pipeline, to its proposed path across the sacred grounds and the Missouri River, the main water source for not only the reservation, but millions of people in its watershed. As a native of the Great Plains, the landscapes and people felt very familiar to me, but this time they weren't overlooked. Their calls for change and accountability were heard even in the midst of a contentious and cacophonous 2016 election, which you all may remember. Visual journalism is powerful because it creates an understanding between viewers and individuals swept up in national stories. And Standing Rock was a part of a reawakening of social and environmental activism that I believe is very much active to this day. In a lot of ways, it was a painful experience too. I recognized blind spots formed in my home state of Nebraska, which has very much whitewashed the history of Native people. I grew up largely unaware of the atrocities that unfolded in the prairies and rolling sandhills we call home. Therein lies the beauty of what we do, though. If we're paying attention, I think that we can accept our own failings and use our camera and our platform as an opportunity to amplify the voices of people who have often been silenced. Environmental inequality led naturally into stories about economic inequality. And having been based in the breadbasket, I spent a lot of time working on stories related to farm life, especially dairies, trying to illustrate the financial difficulties that many small and mid-scale farmers experience, including a story in Western Ohio about a family struggling to keep afloat their dairy farm, which was over-leveraged in a flooded market. Karen here was headed to work an overnight shift at a nursing home, basically just to cover their grocery bills alone and their utilities. They're doing everything right, but the market is not supporting them. The economy is not supporting them. And something I'm always interested in, no matter where I am, is how do people create community? Like at the National Hobo Convention in Britt, Iowa. Highly recommend. I don't know if it's going to happen this year, but August, middle of Iowa, hobos, delightful. Or celebrating prom season in one of the most violence-afflicted neighborhoods of Chicago. This was also part of the Rites of Passage project. Or along a river polluted by coal mining in eastern Kentucky. In all of these places, beautiful communities exist, and similar to the East Chicago story, I didn't want to focus on just, like in this instance, the struggle with the pollution, but rather the people who are existing in that, surrounding those issues, and are celebrating their lives and celebrating each other and supporting each other. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about humanity, and something that we're certainly seeing during the pandemic. Okay, so there's a pandemic happening. And as I've said multiple times already, it's been a very painful moment. And I think Catherine is in this, Catherine Emery, a lovely photographer in San Francisco, is in this conversation. She's had to hear me go on at length about my struggles and sort of like this crisis that I'm feeling as I'm not able to work as I normally do, and wondering like what direction we're going and what is the importance of photography right now. And what I'm reminded as I go through this identity crisis is that what's kept me in this career for so long, for so many years, is the love of communing with people and getting a sense of what their lives are like. Photography is not just a window into the experiences of others, it's also a way for us all to better understand one another. And in this moment, we are more attached to our fellow humans in faraway locales than ever before. And I think that our collective vulnerability reminds us to be moral and decent to one another, and to take responsibilities for our actions and to flatten the curve, as we've all been talking about. It feels like a lifetime ago, but it was only 2 months ago. This is my last assignment before the coronavirus fundamentally changed the way that we work. I photographed life in Bay County, one of Michigan's 12 Democratic strongholds that went for Donald Trump in the 2016 election. And through the story, we learned about American experiences that will shape the presidential election in November, like Robbie Lamas, pictured here, a third-generation auto worker who is the youngest employee at the GM power plant in Bay City, which you can see it right. He said he felt like he hit a lottery job when he got the job. At his last job, working as a cook in a restaurant, he was barely able to pay $400 in rent and have money left over for food. Most people in the Bay City area work multiple jobs, like Aaron Sitkowski, who waits tables at Kunin's, a very popular diner. It's got pretty good food. I recommend if you ever find yourself in Bay City. So she waits tables at Kunin's, and she also works in sales at a printing company, and then she owns a home, but to cover utility bills and her mortgage, she has a roommate. I mean, she's hustling. And so as I process the daily barrage of terrible news about the pandemic, I think of people in Bay County and Bay City who were already struggling to get by. And I wonder how tomorrow looks for them, how 6 months from now look for them, how a year from now looks for them. We're in a time of crisis, and if history teaches us anything, it's that low-income communities usually shoulder the brunt of economic fallout. And so while all of us are taking financial hits during this pandemic, it's certainly hard to ignore. But I'm trying to consider the long-term effects of the crisis and how I can get into a position to document America after the coronavirus. We need journalism to create a better understanding of the fallout of the crisis, and also to hold account national leaders, world leaders, and our communities to take care of people. I think we have a lot of responsibilities, I said before. And while each one of us has lost something in the pandemic, I'd encourage, like a lot of students are struggling. I think we all feel kind of directionless right now. I'd encourage you again to look at this as an opportunity to step back and look at our world with discerning eyes. Take a moment to breathe, to take in everything, and to consider what you can do to better understand our world going forward and to better communicate those issues. I actually have a job today, which is why we had to move up the presentation. So I appreciate everyone being flexible. I'm still working a little bit. It's limited in a lot of ways. I wear masks. I sometimes wear gloves depending on the situation. Same with goggles. I keep a distance of 6 feet. I, at all costs, staying outside so that I can protect the people that I'm photographing. Because I think as photographers, if I'm interacting with 100 people in a week, I could become a super spreader, and that's kind of terrifying. But I think at the same time, there are a lot of stories that need to be highlighted right now. Like this is Maurice Bays. I photographed him for the Wall Street Journal. He's an Amazon delivery man with a compromised immune system who feels that he's risking his life every time he delivers packages in the Baltimore area. And we also need to think about families like the Vigils. Sandra, a single mother of 5, lost her job during driving a commuter bus in a second wave of layoffs. So she lost her job about a month ago. And despite that hardship, she is a fierce advocate for her children and her colleagues. She's really active in the labor union, and she's not beat down. She's looking around, like I'm encouraging us to do, and considering what can I do to make this situation better. So let's go back. I'm gonna shift a little bit towards some archiving work, because that's the majority of what I've been doing during this time, since I'm only going out on assignment maybe once or twice a week. So Dave, are there any, well, first of all, do you all have any questions do you want to add to the chat? Or
Yeah.
David, do you have it now?
I can jump in right there. I think that's a great spot to jump in. I think what Alyssa is about to talk about is incredibly important for all of you. The ability to effectively archive the work that you are doing or that you have done in the past. It will help you leverage what you're going to do when you get out of this. If you're not doing that effectively now, it's going to be hard to, leverage if you have work that you've done that you want to put out there in front of people, if you can't archive in an effective way. So yeah, there were a couple of quick questions that we could hit. I think one of the questions was, it seems like you have like this interesting hybrid of like when you're actually on a shoot of like being a fly on the wall, but at the same time like engaging. And so that was part of what the question was, is I guess, what do you think is the better approach when you're photographing people, to be a fly on the wall or to engage?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is definitely a hybrid. That's a good way of putting it, the way that I work. I think I am not a good photographer for stories where I can't interact with people. I actually if I can't interact with people, I'd rather not be a photographer. That's why I was a bad sports photographer. I did have to do that for a while, but at the end of the day, I actually like interacting with people more than I like taking pictures. And I love taking pictures. And so I think that it sort of depends on the situation. Because of the pandemic, I only spent a little bit of time with Sandra and her children. I spent about 2 hours with Maurice, and we got to know each other a little bit. Although I gotta say, delivering for Amazon is bonkers. Like, he's moving so quickly that we tried to catch up, you know, a little bit. And that's part of the danger too for him, is that he's so overwhelmed and he's so overworked that he's really having to move from place to place without being able to take very much care. And so, yeah, it really depends. Again, a lot of my work, I arrive at a place, I have to build rapport within moments of meeting someone, and then I let them get to their lives. The story that I did on the dairy farm that was struggling, a lot of that I had to build a lot of rapport there, and then they got used to me and started to ignore me. This sounds bad, but I joke that it's about wearing people down, like basically like be present, be fun, and then kind of disappear. And I think like people get that, especially when you explain it to them. I think that what doesn't go well is when you assume people know what the rules are and how this works. Most people aren't used to being photographed. So if you say, hey, I want to get to know you a little bit. I want to talk, and let's kind of tell me a little bit about your life. Tell me about your days. That's a good way to start. And then eventually they just kind of get bored of you. Randy Olson, I teach at the Missouri Photo Workshop, which again, I'm not sure is going to happen this year, but I highly recommend it. Randy Olson is a National Geographic photographer who's also a faculty member there. And he always says that his best skill as a photographer is being boring, because people will just let you exist. I guess that's a long answer to that.
No, I think that's great. You mentioned one other thing, this idea of giving who you're photographing a sense of control. And I think that is extremely important. I mean, I don't care what kind of photographer you are. Yep. If you can allow the person that you're photographing or the people that you're photographing to feel empowered by that moment in some way, that goes so far. And that's part of the reason when you look at Alyssa's photos that I feel like they're so compelling, is because she's doing that. And I know for me, I'm so bad at being a fly on the wall type of photographer, mainly because I'm like a big 6'4" black dude that I can't get out of the way. But I would say it's hard to empower somebody if you're only a fly on the wall, if that makes sense. It's hard to get to that point where you have allowed, them to just accept your presence if you are never interacting with them. So I think that that's a really good and important question. So the next thing was actually kind of interesting. This is from Pat. They said, Alyssa, not sure if I ever mentioned this, but when I was in, I'm guessing junior high school, that means, we had a field trip to Marktown and your photos were displayed in the neighborhood. Residents said they were really guarded, but really appreciated the photographer because she always came back. Realized years later that it was you. Really highlights the importance of building relationships.
Well, that's super cool. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I learned so much from that story and from that community, and both the power for good and the power for destruction that we have as photographers, and I take that pretty seriously.
So we're gonna just keep flying through these. Being a photographer is, this is from Jason, being a photographer is a side gig, which is a blessing and a curse. What would you suggest for photographers that don't have the accessibility to leave their families or their 9-to-5 for a couple of days to photograph something like Standing Rock, but still want to document important moments in history? I think this is a great question, because I know even coming out of this, a lot of the folks, even in this workshop, you're going to have seasons where you're going to have to jump into a 9-to-5 because people aren't beating your door down like they maybe were before for photo gigs. So it's going to be that balance. So maybe you could speak to that, Alyssa.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there was moments with the East Chicago project and other personal projects that I've worked on where I had to make money instead of go. And that's lousy, it's frustrating. But I also think just talking with a writer about this, that like sometimes when we have limitations, it enables us to be more creative, because we can't go to North Dakota for 2 weeks. and work on a story. And I think that while that's frustrating because we feel that yearning, we have that longing to go, I think what it can do is narrow our focus. So, okay, I can't go to North Dakota,
Yeah.
which is beautiful in its own way. Especially if you're from Nebraska, it's much more pretty than Nebraska. But I can work on this story that's a mile away or 5 miles away. And so it helps you narrow your focus. And then two, I encourage you, and I'm going to be doing a 4-day workshop in late June with union docs about finding your voice as a photographer. And so you have to really think about like what it is, as I said at the beginning, what it is that matters to you, what's important to you, and what you feel needs to be said. And I think a lot of those answers to those questions come from where you're from, and what has happened to you in your life, even like what books you've read and what movies you've seen and what music you listen to. I think all of those things can be inspirations. And so, you know, find something small, find something near, because if you don't start the project, if you don't do the work, those images are not going to exist. So it's a balance, and it can be tough. And like at the end of the day, I got to make money. So I would love to do more projects like East Chicago, but I have to make a living. So I understand that, and, you know, work within that balance and work within those limitations.
So I think that is what you're saying is a great point, because we had on one of our True Live sessions, I think it was last week, we had Kevin Koval, who's an incredible poet and writer here in Chicago. And one of the things that he talked about is the importance of being able to tell your own story. Mm-hmm. And I think that is so important, whether you're a writer or a photographer, regardless of what kind of creative you are, being able to tell your own story, because no one else has that story. And I know you hear stuff like that all the time, but this is a moment where, you know, I like how you said, Alyssa, if you see a crowd of photographers, walk the other way. And in a lot of ways, you know, there's a lot of people telling the same stories over and over again right now. Yep. That doesn't diminish the importance of some of these stories. But in this moment, guarantee you guys have a story to tell that no one else has to tell, because you have a vantage point and a perspective that nobody else has. So I think that's super, super key as we're navigating through this time. Moving on, our next question by Mara Shaban. I don't know if I'm saying that name right. I apologize if I'm not. Do you and I'm going to kind of truncate the question a little bit. Do you find that there is commonality with the initial denial of COVID-19 by our government and the denial of climate change? And how do you think this pandemic will change the perception about our resiliency and change our lifestyles for the betterment of the world? So that first part of the question, I think, is important. And I love that, you know, you've always remained like a true journalist. A lot of times you're not, when I've talked to you, you're usually trying your best not to pick a side, even though your work is like, hello, there's my side.
Let the camera speak. Yeah, I mean, I do think that's very important. And I've been asked, it surprised me, I've been asked before to speak about activism in photography, and I really actually try to not be an activist. I do try to be a journalist at the end of the day. I think that we're in an unprecedented moment where journalism is being undermined, and it's very worrisome to me, because I think it has larger implications about the longevity of our existence. You know, and I think that this is a pretty stark moment for that realization, and I'm hopeful that people will start to be more open to finding a truth, or believing journalism, and believing these larger conversations, believing health officials, understanding that there are truths that can enable us to have a brighter future for, you know, for our children and for our nieces and nephews and for future generations, because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. You know, and climate change, similar to COVID-19, is a very difficult subject to photograph. But I think at the same time, it's the largest, those two are the biggest stories of our lifetimes. And so what we have to do is find a way to illustrate that so that people can relate to it and can empathize with those who are most affected by it. I don't know long-term what the fallout is going to look like, but I do think it's going to fundamentally change us. And that's why my focus is on like trying to see the after effects, the economic after effects, especially for people who don't have the opportunity or the space or the funds to advocate for themselves. But it's a big question. And I don't know if I completely answer that, but I think that, you know, we take one day at a time. And we also, like, I'm reading a book on Detroit's bankruptcy, because I think I can learn from it what's going to happen going forward with a lot of communities that are going to be suffering financially. So, you know, thinking about things like that, learning from history while also looking forward.
Okay, let me throw one more question in here, and then let's talk about the archiving process a little bit, because I don't want to miss that. Let's see. This is Pat. How do you assess what assignment is worth taking, and then what kind of protective gear are you using during this time as well? And does it change depending on the situation you're photographing?
Good questions. So I've worked for 4 different clients since this all started. I've lost quite a bit of more like corporate commercial jobs, because surprise, journalism doesn't pay that great. But I'm really trying to limit who I work for and what assignments I take on. I think it's really important for photographers to advocate for themselves for higher day rates right now. Most of the publications are doing that. Some are refusing to, and I think that that's kind of indicative of larger issues within the industry, because I feel that if we freelancers exist in numbers, it's like never been, outside of the coronavirus, never been a greater moment to be a freelance photographer. However, the ecosystem has built up so that we need to be better supported. And so I'd encourage you, if you have editors reaching out to you about stories, advocate to be paid more because of hazard pay, ask for hazard pay. Make sure that you understand what the expectations are, whether or not you're going inside or staying outside. I've exclusively stayed outside. The assignment that I have today is at a shelter, and I may have to go inside. We're going to try to avoid it as much as we can, but it's raining here, so we'll see how that goes. But, you know, like, again, like, I think it's the biggest responsibility right now is for photographers not to be spreading the virus. And so I have, through multiple clients, I've been given N95 masks. I wear that all the time. When I leave my apartment in the building, I wear a mask that a friend in Hong Kong sent me. I'm really trying to think about anytime I'm outside of my personal space, what am I touching, and then what am I touching next? Mm-hmm. And especially, again, because I fear that I could become a super spreader. I'm not wearing gloves because I think that when you're wearing gloves, you don't think as much about what you're touching. But if it's just your bare hands, you're going to notice if you touched a railing, and then you touched your camera, and then you touched your face, or you brought your camera up to your face. So I think, you know, just like little things like that. I am trying to wash my clothes when I get home from an assignment. The virus can only live on cloth for about an hour, but it can live on metal for like 3 or 4 days. It's sort of insane. And so, you know, making like the N95 masks are better because they're more secure around your face. And if you sneeze, it's going to be better contained than, say, like a cloth mask, especially a cotton mask. Were there sub questions there, or did I cover?
No, I think you covered it all. You covered it all.
Okay.
And so I know there's a lot of people that are interested in this archiving ability at this moment, and I think this could be one of the most important parts of the whole workshop. So go for it.
Okay. Little drier, but important. I wish when I started freelancing in 2014 that someone had sat me down and told me what would be a good way to archive. I have basically just developed this process along the way. It works well for me, but I think the number one thing is like figure out what's good for you and then go off of that. You know, learn from other people, but know that there are other directions you can take. So I'm gonna switch screens, and I need to like not get too confused here. Let me see what's after that. Okay. Okay. X. Hold on. Okay, let me get situated, please.
As you're doing that, I can fill the moment a little bit and let me know when you're ready.
Okay.
I think that one, this is so important that you guys are on here. I know a lot of you guys are friends, or maybe you received this from a friend. This is a True Chicago workshop with Alyssa Schukar, award-winning photojournalist, and she's about to share a little bit about how to accurately and effectively archive your work.
All right, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to show that Amazon story that I did. All right, so first here, I take a lot of pictures. I should take fewer, but it is what it is. This is the raw file, and you'll note that I named the images 2020-0328 for the date that they were photographed. And if you do it that way, when you get all of these images from the year in one folder, if you so choose to do that, then it's going to be.
I don't know if we can see. I don't know if we can see it. We're still looking at the screen that says archiving and additional.
Technology. Okay, resume share. Okay, and then I'm going to stop share, and then I'm going to share screen. Desktop. Okay. Are you seeing my desktop?
Yes, I believe so. Yep.
Okay, so this folder. All right.
Okay, got it. We're in.
All right. So you can see that it's named by the date, the year, the month, the date, and then dash WSJ for Wall Street Journal, and then COV for COVID. This is basically like a system that reminds me by looking at the file without having to actually look at the image what the project is. I like to have, every photographer is going to have what they want with systems, but I like to just keep the final 4 numbers for the image file that is native to the camera. Okay, and so I'm going to switch to Photo Mechanic, and I think I have to switch this again. Stop sharing now.
If you don't have Photo Mechanic, that's like step 1.
Yeah. Photo Mechanic is a really wonderful tool to process images in a much faster way than Lightroom. I choose my select files in Photo Mechanic, and then I import everything into Lightroom, which is where I tone. But what I can also do in Lightroom, now you get to see inside my brain, is, let's see, this is fine. I can also put caption information. So for clients like the Wall Street Journal, I have to make sure that I have like good journalistic captions in there too. And so this is like the industry standard. This is the expectation that everyone has. That's annoying. Okay. And so looking back here, you can see this is obviously already been tagged, but I go through the entire take. And along the way, in the first sweep, if I like an image, I'll tag it with a 3, which makes it orange. And then I take away all of the images that I didn't tag. And so we'll have all of these. And then as I go through these, on the second swing, I'll tag them with a 2, which makes them red. And then on the third swing, I'll tag them with a 1, which makes them pink. And so basically what that then does, I have to switch back to Finder. Oh, weird. Okay. What that then does is allows me to move the files into different folders. Again, this is how I do it. It's not going to be how everyone approaches it, but I have those pink images that were selected that were starred 3 in 01 selects, and then the runners up are in 02 seconds, thirds in 03 thirds, and the entire take is in 04 take. And so what that then enables me to do is if I'm coming back to the images later, I can just open up this folder and I don't have to dig through everything, because that's my big frustration. If I have 900 images in the folder and I'm looking for 18 of them, I want to be able to just immediately know where they are. And so a big part of this also goes into my archiving system. Let me switch to Chrome. Oh, why are you not allowing me to switch to Chrome? Tell you what, I think I can do. Are you seeing Chrome now?
I think, yeah.
Okay, good. I think that'll work better. So I use PhotoShelter to keep my entire archive. I also have 2 hard drives that I keep at home for every year. On those hard drives, everything in their raw form is on here. I convert, so I'm a Canon photographer, but I convert everything to DNG, and this is important. The raw camera, the raw file type that you get out of your camera, whether it's CR2 or NEF, and I can't remember what the Sony ones are proprietary file types. And my concern about those file types, and I may be totally wrong about this, but my concern about those file types is that in 20 years, you won't be able to open them because Canon's gonna be like, yeah, we didn't really wanna have to update that. So if you convert them to DNG, whether in Lightroom or through Adobe DNG Converter, you're then converting them to a non-proprietary file type that basically is going to be forever accessible. I heard some horror stories about a photographer during 9/11 who's not able to open his files because he never converted them to a non-proprietary, to an open source file type. So as you can see, everything is organized by month. You can kind of get this idea. Like, I was in New Hampshire for the New York Times back when like 2020 the election was the thing. And so I have all of this organized so I can quickly see. And then like I did something for the Urban Institute. But I have an idea. If I need to find an image for a client, I just go to the year and I go to the month and then I find that file. You can also keep all of these under the same folder under 2020. I just find things are a little bit more accessible because of the volume of work. And so if you go to PhotoShelter, you can see, like, say I don't want to connect to the hard drive, but I do want to find the images from that Amazon job. So I'm going to go to 03 March, and I'm going to find COVID-19 Amazon for Wall Street Journal. And then all of those files exist here in their raw format. The advantage of PhotoShelter, and honestly, it's expensive. It's like, I think $500 a year for the level that I have, but it's unlimited storage. And so if you think about it, like hard drives are about $500 too. So I'm essentially buying a hard drive every year that I know is not going to crash. But at the same time, I still have at least 2 hard drives of the work at home. And then I also have hard drives that I've shipped off to friends, one in New York, and then my family who now live in Texas. And so the idea is you're kind of like spreading the ability to lose the work. At the end of the day, you know that every hard drive that you have is going to fail. And so you want to have a hybrid system basically of hard drives and the cloud to make sure that you have everything. But you also don't want to just upload everything willy-nilly. You've got to be very organized about it, because otherwise what you're going to end up doing is what I have been doing with my early freelance work during this time, which is desperately trying to organize things. And it takes a long time if you're going back to do it. So as you can see on here, I also use PhotoShelter to deliver files. Like I sent some files this morning to the East Chicago work, actually, to the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. They're putting together basically like this PDF of public housing that's been built on environmentally unsafe locations. And so put these up on here, and then I can just share. I can like choose what kind of size that they're going to get, and I can just share these images with them. And so that way I'm also able to track what images people have. Of course, this was also sent with a contract. You never want to give files to anybody without first creating a contract. And if you guys want to see some of my contracts, I'd be happy to send you some PDFs that I've created on a Dropbox file folder so that you can take a look and sort of build off of them. You'd be welcome to take the language in any capacity that you want. If you are interested, let me put this in the thread or the chat. I don't know if I can access it. I'm going to chat this to you, David.
Okay.
And if you'll share that with the group,
Got it.
You'll get $15 off. You can also start with just
Hey.
a trial version, but this is like the most important investment that I make every year for my photography business. Thank you. And then, so another part of it that I've really been working on since this all began is updating my archive on Redux. And so what this does is basically makes my archive much more available to the wider market around the world. And so if the images sell on here, I'm not necessarily going to make as much money as if I had just sold them straight out of off of my own website. But this is also a place that a lot of organizations and publications go to. And so they're able to say like, okay, we're looking for a story, we're looking for images about food lines. And then they can add these, and basically it's a form of passive income that I think is incredibly important for photographers to build into their workflow. I think this kind of thing is a little bit easier for photojournalists because there's more of a demand, but at the same time, like, you have to be constantly updating and creating new work that can be licensed. And a big part of this also is copyright work. So I'm working with this organization called Higbee, Higbee and Associates, to go after copyright infringements. They're fantastic. They're also helping me do the archive or the copywriting work. I don't know if any of y'all have tried to copyright work before, but it is a nightmare. Like the website is not very user-friendly to say the least. And so they're lawyers. They do it as part of the service where they send the work and copyright it for you once you deliver it to them. Yeah, David.
A couple of just really relevant comments coming in on this. This is from Liz. For things you're selling as stock photography, do you have photo waivers from the people shown in the images?
That's a good question. So the majority of work that I do is journalism, which does not require releases. If you're doing anything that's going to be used in advertising, then yes, you do need a release. And so I could submit some, I maybe like 5 times a year, although probably not in 2020, 5 times a year I do work where I have people sign waivers. And so I could upload those to here, and I could let the people who process the images know that these have waivers, and so they technically could be used in advertising, but it's just not something I do. And generally, I mean, if you're doing a commercial job, it's not going to be content that Redux would want anyway, because it more likely be set up, if that makes sense. But I kind of go back and forth with releases. I think in some ways they're super useful because it gives you an opportunity to use, like, you have a wider range of opportunity to use an image. But at the same time, in journalism, it really creates a wall between you and the person that you're photographing. I think it's kind of problematic because it makes it more of a transactional relationship, and unnecessarily complicates things. Same with art photography. You don't have to have releases, but you just need to make sure that the images are not being used to make money.
Yeah.
In a commercial sense.
Another one, if you don't have something like Redux, do you have any other suggestions on how to sell?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. A lot of my work for the New York Times also gets put out on their syndicate, which makes it kind of difficult to sell too. That's not the end of the world. That's why you get a day rate. You can certainly sell the work on your website. Photo Shelter does have options. Let me see if I can quickly access that. Yeah, so I think, I can't quite see this. Let me see. So you see this like little dollar sign. Basically, that makes you can make it for sale essentially. But again, like, the big issue for independent photographers and for people who are on their own, it's hard to get people to go to your site. So if you can build a relationship, whether it's with a collective or with an agency like Redux, you're going to have more opportunity. But unfortunately, it's otherwise kind of limited. A lot of people right now are doing flash print sales on Instagram and on Twitter, and that would be a good way to go to drive up a little bit of income right now.
Yeah. Okay, continue. Go for it.
So again, making sure that you sort of have this system that makes sense for you. I think that it can feel sort of overwhelming, but that there's this space that gets created where you're a little bit more in control. And that's the goal at the end of the day. I also have for every drive and every sequence of folders, I have something in notes. I use notes for like my to-do list and general organization, where I have a sense of like, okay, there's 2.5 terabytes of space left on this drive. I checked it on April 30th. It's synced with Photo Shelter. So it's essentially a way for me to take notes. I also have tags on here. The purple and blue, the blue means that the project is finished and backed up on other drives. And then the purple means that it's on Photo Shelter. So it's archived on the web as well. Do you guys have any, I realize I'm throwing a lot at you right now. So
Good.
Do you have any questions?
Yeah, I'm picking up a couple more questions here. Are you using Pixie to help you with copyright?
So I was using Pixie for a little bit, and I do think that that's a really good resource too. In fact, if you're a member of Women Photograph, they're giving you 6 free months right now. And I think there may be some other organizations that they're doing something similar with. Her name is.
You guys should be writing down all of these resources if you're not.
Let me pull up her email address. You can send her an email and see if she may be willing to give you 6 free months as well. I think it's a really good resource. I switched to Higby because I found that there was less legwork for me to do. It was a little bit overwhelming. Yep, I got this email address. Okay, I'm gonna message this to you as well.
Okay.
Cool. So reach out to Hannah. She rocks. Maybe. Yep, there we go. It's a really great way to work too. I just found that I didn't quite have like I couldn't devote enough time to do it because they find an insane amount of infringements. It's really very eye-opening. And I'd recommend that if you start working with Pixie, that you first upload your Instagram account to Pixie and like have that be where you start, because you realize like people are just constantly lifting stuff. Unfortunately, like with a number of the websites are in countries where you can't pursue infringements, which is very much intentional. But it's something where it sort of is eye-opening, and for me really drove home the importance of doing copyright work so that you have a better legal standing to go after that infringement.
No, that's great. I think the next question that I was going to ask is, are you only putting outtakes on Redux?
So it depends a little bit. There are some clients where the contract isn't very friendly to Redux, and so I have to be careful on that. But basically what I'm doing is I edit down the work, and then I upload it, and then in the email to the people who handle the images at Redux, I'm like, this is who the client was for. So if it's the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, they'll have a good sense of what the contract is already. And so you don't have to worry about too much. And then with Redux, they'll delete duplicate images. So you can certainly like edit down the amount of work that you send, but I'm basically sending all of the images that I sent to the client, I am submitting to Redux, and all of the images that I submit to the client, I'm also copywriting.
That's great. So I'm gonna just spit a couple of quick questions at you. What's your go-to workhorse body?
Wait, my camera?
Yes.
Like, what?
You're like, what are you talking about? Yes, camera
The
body.
Canon 5D4.
Okay. Then let's see. The next one that I was going to ask was, how is everything looking for Prism workshop this year?
Good question. We have an email coming out this next week. As of now, we are pushing it to the fall. Get a little bit of background. Prism Photo Workshop we launched last May, designed to support young photographers in the Chicago area. I think that the first 5 years of any photographer's career is among the most difficult financially, and so our whole idea, similar to True Chicago, is to support people in that time and specifically work with photojournalists. We're going to announce that we're pushing to the fall. We had planned to do it in May, but obviously things happened. Right now, we think most likely it's going to be online, which is a bummer. But we also hope that means that we'll have a wider depth of people joining us. It's going to be free if it's online too, rather than the whopping $12 it was last May. Michelle Egan's of the New York Times will be speaking, as will Clarissa Bonet, who's a wonderful Chicago-based artist, and Sebastian Hidalgo, who is a Chicago-based photojournalist who's currently working on a project for National Geographic, very fancy. And then I and Michelle Kanar and Michael Zajikowski will also share some tips on the importance of contracts and bookkeeping and ethics. So a little less exciting on our part, but equally important, in my opinion, if you want to build a sustainable business. But we'll send that email out soon. We have some very exciting announcements, including a $500 scholarship for a Chicago area student interested in pursuing photojournalism who has at least a year left, whether in high school or in college. And then we also are going to announce a $500 grant for a photographer to pursue a story in the Chicago area, a Chicago-based photographer to pursue a story that reflects our mission statement, which is to support photographers who want to tell stories of underrepresented communities with empathy and ethical approaches.
That's great. Make sure we'll make sure to get the information once you get all of that out. We'll make sure to share that information as well.
Appreciate that.
The last couple of things. One of the things I wanted to ask is, I know a lot of people are thinking, man, like, I mean, all of this is great, but how?
Sorry, am I still there?
Oh yeah. Whoa, that's
Okay.
scary. I don't know what happened. Where'd you go? Oh, we're back. Okay.
Okay.
How did you? I mean, how did you get the guts to approach some of these bigger name clients that you have, or how did you initially approach that relationship with a large client like New York Times or Wall Street Journal? I know we have some folks that maybe even aren't photojournalists, that they have aspirations to approach large clients. Like, you maybe speak to that.
Again, the biggest thing is to do the work you want to get hired to do. I've definitely driven that point home, but also like work on relationships. I was able to do the New York Times portfolio review, which was a wonderful opportunity to connect with other photographers as well as editors. And I know that some work came from that. A couple times, once a year, I'll go up to New York and do office visits. That's like a little bit stressful, but it's generally a pretty friendly community and people are excited to talk about photography and also like get a break from their job. But it can be hard, I think, especially when you're starting out. It's like, how can I get my foot in the door? Doing mailers is really helpful, whether it's a physical postcard or an email. I think, again, like realizing that editors are people who have good days and have bad days, and who both love to be approached by photographers and find it to be incredibly tedious, is important. And so have that balance, understand that even if you don't hear back from them, it's not about you or your work. It's just sort of this everyday effort to get the publication out that they're working on. And so, joining groups like Women Photograph has a bunch of really wonderful resources and opportunities. And again, it's about joining that community. The Authority Collective is amazing as well. And I think what those online communities do is essentially give you a space where, and you can do this in Chicago or wherever you're based as well, where you can find a community of photographers who will support you in the lean times, and who will share, if they can't do an assignment, they'll be like, you know who you should reach out to is this photographer, David. He's fantastic. He's based in Chicago, and he'll do exactly what you need. And so I think and then also recommending other people. I think that there's sort of, I mean, obviously photography is a very competitive field, but there's also, it's also a really supportive and wonderful community in a lot of ways. And again, you have to create the community that you want to be a part of. So that comes down to actively supporting each other, and it always pays back. There's never been anything I've done where I've helped another photographer and been like, gosh, I wish I hadn't done that. It's what's so wonderful about the community.
One more question that we'll throw in there. This is from DeAndre. He's asking about, how you treat editing. Are you kind of presenting a lot of your photos as is, or are there moments where you're adding some drama into it, color and tone wise?
Okay. So I can't go beyond as a journalist, I can't go beyond what it looks like. But at the same time, you also can't just present a raw file to a client. They're not going to be very happy about that. So I work in Lightroom. I have a profile basically that I put over all of the files, and then I individually tone them as well. I think basically you don't want to go beyond dodging and burning, which is an old darkroom approach, where basically you're making an area darker or you're making it lighter. And so you can do that, you can adjust the color a little bit, but I do try to make things look how they appear to me in the moment.
That's great. That's great. Well, I mean, the last couple of comments that I'll make, and then we can allow you to make any comments that you want to make. You mentioned the importance of a handwritten note. I think that is something that will go a long way too, for those of you guys that are wanting to approach prospective clients. And I really like how you've talked about this in the past when we've done other workshops and stuff together, just this idea of going out to create the work that you want to be hired to do. If it doesn't exist, someone's not going to magically hire you to go do the work that you are saying you could figuratively do. You should literally go do it. And then your chances of being hired to do that will go up. I also really loved what you talked about, just this importance of touch. And this is something that I'll just say my piece and then you can say yours. Basically, I think touch is everything in a lot of ways. It's something that has, in a lot of ways made us who we are. And it's not possible right now, but I don't think that means that there's no chance for actually reaching and connecting with others during this time. Even a moment like this, in some ways, we're reaching out and making that relational connection, which I think is absolutely vital during this time. I really think, and you were kind of alluding to this earlier, just the importance of finding your voice as a photographer. This is something that you can reflect on and even identify during this time, that I think, whether you have a camera in your hand or you're putting it down, that's something that you can really work on. I really, one of the things that I admire about Alyssa is that you've seemed to identified a little bit of what your purpose is with your gift. And I always tell young creatives that if you haven't identified purpose as far as what you're doing with your gift, then your gift just goes to the highest bidder all the time. And that's what separates someone like Alyssa from a lot of the other field, to me personally as a photographer as well, because you're seeing someone who's identified a little bit of purpose and her purpose and how she used her gifts are overlapping. And so that is what brings the work alive and makes it so meaningful. And so I'll end with this. This is just a quote that I've been thinking a lot about and really using as something to provoke me during this time as an artist. This is Toni Morrison who said this. She said, "This is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no time for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. This is how civilizations heal." And I think that this is a moment like that, where we take in this information and it's not just info. This is a moment where we can start to identify purpose and identify, hey, what is my gift actually for? And how can I use it to bring myself and other people alive? So with all of that said, I know that was a lot. I appreciate it, Alyssa. And if there's anything you wanted to close with, you can.
Oh, that was beautiful. Amen to that. You mentioned the postcards. I'll show this real quick. So this is what the postcard looked like. I got it on Artifact. The Artifact Uprising, they do really beautiful printing. And on the back, it just says like DC-based photographer, yada, yada, yada. And then it's in an envelope so it doesn't get damaged. That makes a big difference. And like it's expensive and it's really time consuming, but again, it's about making that personal connection. I think people really appreciate that. Yeah, I keep thinking about, especially as I'm preparing for this, the workshop I mentioned with Union Docs is like, so what does that mean to have a voice? And I think in a lot of ways it means to be able to speak with like emotional clarity. And when we're busy, we don't have time to process much. You know, we're overwhelmed and we're just kind of getting from point A to point B. So to echo what David so lovingly said, you know, slow down, breathe a little bit, think about the moments in your life that have shaped you and what it is about photography that you think is so powerful. And then when it becomes safe to do so, be prepared to go out there and to document our world with empathy and understanding. And please reach out if there's anything that I can do for you. It may take me a while to get back, but I will.
Let's do this, guys. I mean, feel free to, I just put our info, truechicago.co. That's our IG and our website. We're going to continue to do workshop moments like this, and twice a week on Tuesday and Thursdays, we are doing IG Live with just important, influential creatives as well. And then on Saturdays, we're doing creative brunches. Would love to just receive any of you guys' feedback. I will just say this, that man, I think some of the times where I've experienced the most growth as a creative and as a photographer is when I put the camera down and when I was allowing myself to process and allowing myself to reflect. And so this is a moment like that. Don't lose that moment. If you can't tell, one of the things that I really love about Alyssa is just she has a piece about her, and I think this is a time where you should go ahead and allow yourself to feel a little bit of peace in the silence, at least. So yes, make sure you reach out to Alyssa if you have any other questions. You can reach out to us. My name is David Johnson. I'm the founder and director of True Chicago. Would love to have you guys a part of things that we're doing in the future. So make sure you are checking us out. Feel free to DM, email. I'll put my email in here as well. And yeah, thank you guys for being here. And we will be in contact with all of you guys. Make sure you stay safe. And this was great. Thank you, Alyssa. I'm going to unmute everybody so you can clap. She didn't take any money from this or anything, so let's just show our love to Alyssa for a second. Yay! Woo. Yeah. Thank you, guys. Have a great day.